Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the next of our speakers in the Speakers Inc. We Speak Global Speakers Showcase. Today is the turn of a young lady who is passionate. She's energetic. She has got a really great view on the world, and her energy, enthusiasm, and drive and vision, most importantly, most certainly do come through in her talk. Ntsiki Mkhize is a South African-born global citizen with her eyes fixed on creating a globally connected mentorship network of female social entrepreneurs through her business Ment Her. That's Menther. Look it up. It's worth having a look. She is an entrepreneur with experience in agriculture, property, and media. She's a self-published author of her inaugural book, My Hall of Mentors, and the founding editor of Ment Her magazine. An expert keynote speaker, which you're about to find out, and also facilitator. Her topics include resilience, mentorship, EQ, and the ultimate social impact strategy, which she will be presenting today. Ntsiki holds a master's degree in social innovation and is the host of Career Connect on Business Day TV and the Ment Her Conversations podcast as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me to welcome the wonderful Ntsiki Mkhize.
Have you ever wondered if our favorite cities that we see in the movies could exist outside of the blockbusters? One in particular, Wakanda from Black Panther. That's right, if you are a Marvel fan or just somebody who loves to go to the movies, then you know all about the hidden city of Wakanda and the power of its vibranium. Now, I don't know if you know this, but Wakanda does not actually exist, but I often think about Africa as its own Wakanda. Hi, I am Ntsiki Mkhize, a social entrepreneur based in South Africa. I run a business called Ment Her, which is a global mentorship network that supports female social entrepreneurs who have ideas or who are in the early seed stages of their business. We help them to get started, get going, and get growing. We offer access to mentorship, access to networks, markets, and ultimately to funding. And when I've been working with the women within our network, when I've been connecting with entrepreneurs across the continent, I think about the richness and the great wealth that sits within this continent. Now, if you think about Africa and its position in the world, and you know our history, you know about the golden spice route, you know about the silk route, you know about all these different golden routes that interconnected through Africa, down past Cape Coast, and even through the canals. You know about the trade that happened in Egypt north of the West Coast. And we hear these great stories of these great civilizations that existed back then, and somehow they seem to have dwindled, and we're not thinking about creating those great societies anymore. In fact, for most people, when you think about Africa today, you think about lack. You think about a lack of resources. You think about poverty. You think about social issues. All these things that come to mind if you haven't been to Africa are probably quite negative about what's happening on the continent. I'd like to challenge you to change that perspective and to think about Africa as the continent of possibility, to think about Africa as the continent that has the answer and the key to the future of the world's survival, the world's growth, the world's innovation, and ushering in a new age of sustainability. Now, if you think about Africa and you look into some of the stats around the trade that is happening in the continent and with other countries and other continents, Africa from a population perspective has 1.3 billion people and counting, which puts us a little after China. Africa as a continent, our international trade is up to 3% of the world's global trade, and that's just from finished goods. But that number goes a lot higher when you think about the amount of raw materials that get exported before being converted and then re-imported back into the country. If you look at our population, 50% of the African population is under the age of 35, considered youth, and 50% of that population is under the age of 15. Now, if you look at global reports around the future of countries that have aging populations, declining population numbers, those countries are quite concerned. But when you flip the coin and you look at what's happening in Africa, you see ample opportunity and possibility. And finally, the thing that people often think about is the level of social issues and the amount of poverty. The fact that there is still in many countries people that don't have access to basic resources such as water, sanitation, electricity, basic food security, which is all quite interesting for a continent that is rich and abundant in those very same resources. So let's think about it. Let's think about how do we grow as businesses. Let's think about how do we grow as a people. And let's think about how do we partner for possibilities. And in this age where we're hearing a bunch of new terms, one thing that comes up a lot is ESG, environment, social, and governance. When you're thinking about your company's own ESG measures and how you're reporting on those, how much of your interactions, how much of your reporting considers partnering with Africa for possibilities, not just for now, but for the future? How much of your strategy is bedded in partnering with African organizations or even considering opening up an African office? Now, a couple of years ago, this may have been the furthest thing from anyone's mind, sitting in a corporate office somewhere in Europe or in America. But more and more what we're seeing now is that people are turning to the continent, not just for its resources, but for understanding how do we partner with local organizations to create greater impact. And if you're thinking along those lines, and I'd like to present to you what I think is the ultimate social impact strategy with 4 key things that you should think about that make Africa the place for opportunity and growth: women, youth, resources and social problems, social entrepreneurship, impact, and innovation. Let's start with women. Now, we know from research that if you give a woman money, it has the highest chance of trickling down into the family, into the community, and ultimately into the economy. We know that women make and create impact. While oftentimes it's unseen or perhaps not reported, women are the highest impact people in terms of making decisions on behalf of the household. And for a lot of households who do live in poverty, women are the decision makers. A lot of the trend that we see across Africa is that women are the heads of households, being single parent households. So they are the ones who are breadwinners. They are the ones who are caregivers. They are the ones starting the micro businesses and the organizations that come together to make a difference in their communities and society. Women are also the ones who are starting businesses. So if we look at the third sector, specifically in South Africa, where nonprofit organizations exist, a number of those nonprofit organizations are run by women. A lot of the people who volunteer in those organizations are women. And so that stands to reason that if we empower women, we empower the nation. We have a saying in my home language, isiZulu, that says, "Watinta umfazi, watinta imbogodo." And if you touch a woman, you strike a woman, you strike a rock. And that is because women are indeed the bedrock of our society. So think about that for a minute. Think about how your company, your business, your products can have a multiplier effect in communities just by empowering women. What we saw from some of the stats that came out in the past 2 years is that companies that are led by women are higher performing, and companies that had women in their boards as well were also higher performing. And this lets us know that there is an untapped potential that we could look into there that can make a huge difference, supporting and working with women who've already been in the space for years. That just because it hasn't been seen, noticed, or supported doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The youth. With a growing population in the continent, we know that if we give these young people access to resources, access to knowledge, access to information, they can do incredible things. And that when we look at this population, we should not just see a growing population that could be workers, but see a growing population of innovators, people who understand their countries, people who understand their communities, people who understand their peers, and most importantly, people who have ideas and solutions to the problems that they face. And if we can create an ecosystem that allows young people to gain access to knowledge and information and to resources to be able to transform their ideas into actions, into implementation, we have a whole new dawn of social innovators and creators that can make a difference. problems and solutions. Now, we know that businesses simply exist to solve a problem, that where there is an itch, where there is a gap, if you find the idea that solves the problem, you're in business. And so it makes sense that if there are so many problems across the continent, that we can find solutions to make a difference, to create businesses that then thrive in the continent. And this is something that we need to think about with care. It's something that we need to approach the continent and people and organizations that live in Africa and operate in Africa and say, how do we partner together to make a difference? It's a space where we can't dictate, but we need to partner because the avenues are different, because the way people move is different, because the way things are set up is different. And we can't assume that the way things have been done in the West can easily be a copy-paste solution and work exactly the same across the continent. So how do we partner? How do we create? How do we co-create for greater impact and for business opportunities? Not just that, but to also say, are there alternative business models? Are there alternative economic models that we can consider that work differently in the continent to make the difference and the impact that we want to see? And ultimately going, if we're exporting so many resources from the continent in the form of raw materials, how much production can we set up in the continent that allows us to process those resources before they're exported? And what kind of job opportunities, what kind of work and economic opportunities could stem from such networks? And then finally, thinking about social entrepreneurship, social innovation, and social impact. From an innovation perspective, I think the simplest definition is to think about innovation as taking something that's already been developed, that's already been created, and figuring out how to adapt it in a new way for a new cause in a new context. And there are several solutions that exist from an academic perspective in research and development and in products that have already been developed in other countries that can be utilized in an African context. And we should create the freedom of space to figure out how those innovations can be adapted, but also to find out from the youth and the women who already work in these spaces to see what innovations do they have that can make a difference. From an entrepreneurship perspective, answering the question, how do we shift the majority of people from being micro businesses or from being survival entrepreneurs into being thriving entrepreneurs and into being the kind of thriving entrepreneurs that create the kinds of innovations that can lead to unicorns? And finally, impact, right? So if we take the challenges that exist and the ideas that people have and the experience that people have and give them the autonomy to create and create ecosystems around them that allow them to create ideas, to fail, to create businesses, to create and implement solutions for greater impact, what does that impact look like and how can we partner and support that impact? And finally, to challenge ourselves to see impact as beyond just scaling a particular business, but rather going, how do we scale solutions? That if you can solve for water or food shortages or a lack of access to electricity or whatever the social issue might be in one country context, that same solution can be duplicated in another country context. And that when we think about innovation and entrepreneurship in Africa, that potentially it doesn't look like scaling businesses, but rather scaling impact. And that we across the world can be partners for possibilities, partners for change, and partners for ushering in a new dawn through creating a different kind of social impact. I hope that your brains are tinkling. I hope that you're finding new connections and you're thinking about the wealth of vibranium that is Africa. And more than just that, that you're thinking about, wait, is this about to leave me behind? Is this the ship that I'm going to miss? Is this the new wave of change that I haven't adapted to? Don't let it catch you off guard. Partner with me and let's talk about how your business can make an impact across the African continent and how your business can adapt itself to working and partnering with organizations in Africa. I'd like to say to you, welcome to Wakanda, but I think it's more apt that I say to you, welcome to Africa. And let's partner for possibilities. Let's partner.
Ntsiki, thank you so much for your time. And thank you for your energy and your passion in the talk. I'm going to start simply by saying, why this topic? Why so passionate? Tell me more.
Thank you so much, Danae. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you guys and everyone who's streaming in from different parts of the world. I must say, speaking about social impact, social innovation, social entrepreneurship in 20 minutes is really hard for me because I absolutely enjoy the topic. It's something I'm passionate talking about. And really, for me, coming from South Africa, but having had the opportunity to go overseas and do a master's in social innovation, I see a lot of what happens on the ground with social entrepreneurs, even though a lot of people actually don't self-identify as that. But when we look at South Africa, and I think in a lot of countries, when we look at how hard hit our socioeconomic status was by the global pandemic, we start to see how many women actually fill the gaps where government and social structures fall apart, or even where corporates aren't able to reach or don't really consider that kind of responsibility to be part of their mandate. And we see how these women every single day, through their volunteering initiatives, through their nonprofits, through their non-government organizations, do a lot of work to support the community, and this is across the entire gambit of a sustainable development goals. And so when it comes to me being an entrepreneur, having started my own business, having worked with nonprofits and social enterprises and corporate, is answering the question of how do we start to create sustainable enterprises that address social issues and allow people to be profitable, which means that they are sustainable as well. And also realizing that that's something we can't do by ourselves. We need corporates to come to the table. We need government to come to the table. And it's one of those things that when I think about it, if one person wins, everyone wins, the entire ecosystem wins. And I'd like to get people to start thinking about social innovation and impact along those lines.
That's fantastic, because it really does lead me to the first of one of the questions that were sent into us while you were on the talk. Why should companies globally be thinking, which is what you were talking about now, it takes those companies to be involved. Why should companies globally be thinking about their social impact strategy? And there's a follow-on question, part two of the same question. And who in those companies needs to think about it? That's a very interesting question. In fact, both are.
Yeah. So, corporates need to be thinking about this because, if you've gone to school and learned about business at any level, the traditional teaching is that profit maximization, shareholder maximization is what we're looking for. So we will fire people, we will retrench, we will cut corners, we'll do whatever we need to do to make sure we can increase profits to maximize the value given back to the shareholders. But what we're seeing is that that's just not sustainable, right? You have the richer getting richer and the poor getting poorer, and this gap in between is something that no one's really addressing. And so corporates globally need to be thinking about it, because who they engage with as customers and who they engage with in terms of the communities where they get employees to come from does ultimately affect the bottom line of the business. So for example, if you think about setting up your operation in a country that has low skills and low education levels, it's going to be very difficult for you to source the kind of talent that you need to be able to grow in that country. So your country strategy would be bringing in the human resources from other countries so you can have an operation in that region. So when you think about social impact, you need to be thinking about, who's supporting the schools to make sure that there's the right level of math and science, who's supporting the universities to make sure that these children are able to study. And ultimately, in the end, at some point, that does impact on your business. So really getting corporates to think about it more holistically, not just at the point of engagement, but from the beginning of the supply chain to say, what ultimately impacts our bottom line and how can we help that? And even if the byproduct of that is helping society, it's understanding that in the end, it does help your business. And I think everyone in the organization should be thinking about it. Leaders need to be thinking about it in terms of how they drive the organization and where they see the business going in the next 20, 50 years even, and really, I think the organizations that are going to exist 50 to 100 years from now are those that are able to pivot along social lines and incorporate the community in the work that they do. And more specifically, I think, hiring people like social impact strategists, hiring innovation people within your business, those are the kind of people that would drive the strategy. And I even think at an employee level, when you think about how people give back in South Africa, this July, we always have Nelson Mandela Day and people volunteer on those days. And yes, you can go pay into school, but also thinking about your capital and your intellect, where can you go as a person who works in a corporate, as an accountant, for example, as a tax practitioner, as a person who understands strategy, where can you go and give back with your skills into communities or into small businesses where people would traditionally struggle with those kinds of skills and insights?
So it really is a win-win situation, company and obviously the society within which that company works. And also, it's a long-term strategy. This is something that really will benefit companies in the long term.
Yeah, and you have to think about it long term, because if you're not thinking about the end game, and I think oftentimes people just think about their time in office and what works for them. But powerful companies and growing companies, sustainable companies that really will have a good impact, need to think about the strategy that they're building and where they're taking the business and the baton that they're going to hand over. And are they handing over something that people can keep running with for the next cycle and the next cycle and the next cycle until 50 years from now? We've got those globally active organization, but that's entrenched in the culture, entrenched in community. And we're seeing a lot of that. Consumers are becoming more socially conscious, more consumer conscious, and not just around environmental issues. We've seen organizations being boycotted because of statements people have made that were found to be homophobic or whatever, or racist. So thinking about those things and going, we can't continue just to deliver products and services. People care about who we are holistically as an organization. And I think on the other side of that, that translates into your social impact strategy as well.
I love the fact that you said holistic, because that really is the attitude that we need to have. It's not a one size fits all. It's not a definite approach. It's an approach that needs to be holistic and needs to take into account all of those facets before you can really be successful in this environment, right?
100%.
Now, something else we hear a lot about is ESG. Now, where does ESG fit in?
Sure. So I think a lot of people might not use the term, social impact strategy, but they have those ESG measures, which is your environment, your social, and your governance. And that's kind of in addition to your King 3 reporting, that now if you're thinking about, does your company incorporate any sustainable development goals? Does it impact anywhere in those spaces that you can measure those across your ESG? And we've seen a couple of the global stock exchanges in different countries actually have a social impact measure. So you can actually go see which companies have good social impact and where they're sitting on that scale of social impact. But if you're struggling and about your social impact strategy, that's one place that you can look at, internally and externally. So internally going, what's our production? What do we do on a daily basis that has a huge impact on environment, social, and governance? So for example, where are you located as a business, and what is your internal carbon footprint in, how much printing happens in the organization, in terms of social, thinking about your people internally, what do we do for our staff around resilience, which is one of the things that I talk about. What do we do for our staff in terms of development? Is there career projections? Are there mentorship programs in place? And that's something else that I talk about. And then in terms of governance, what systems do we have in place to ensure that good decision making is happening? And then externally thinking about it from where do we operate? Where are our products consumed? What is the end chain of our products? So it's not just about making this beverage that's consumed, but where do the disposable plastics of our beverage end up? If we're making clothes and we're using lots of water in that process and we're dyeing water, where do we send that water? How are we treating that water in the ecosystem? And are we responsible for that end point of water and that entire chain of impact? And then socially as well, the community that you operate around, where you get your employees from, but also your customers. And how do your customers show up in the world? And can you do better socially to make sure that you're improving not just the consumer experience, but the lived experience of your customers, which is really the far end of social impact for me. And governance as well is, companies no longer just playing it safe, but having a voice, companies saying, yes, actually, we don't agree with these particular laws that have been taken on. We don't agree with these particular decisions. And we as a company stand for this particular group of people, or we as a company stand against this kind of behavior, and having a voice, and I think those kinds of things make a difference, because customers are looking at that, employees are looking at that. And ultimately, at the end of the day, any company is people, it's not a building somewhere, it's the people in the organization that make the difference. So along our ESG, we need to make sure that our values and our ethos around it is reflective of who is in the organization and who the organization exists to serve.
It really is so refreshing and fascinating, because there are so many facets that I think people don't think about on the surface. When they think about their social impact, they don't really think about all of those things. You talking about where that plastic goes from the bottles from which their particular product comes. It really is, there's so much more to it. And this is really very interesting. You are clearly very passionate about this, which is lovely to see. I've got one more question for you before you go. And it's something I really have wanted to ask you right from the beginning. Why is it so important to have women and youth as part of the strategy? I don't want to say a word before I hear you reply.
It is absolutely important. I like to think about this analogy, and I always look at, I mean, I'm not the best understanding person when it comes to sports, right? But when I look at sports and, let's say soccer, for example, and you're paying all of your players in the millions, right? But half of your team is on bench, and I think about it like, how are you winning when you have half your team on the bench, right? And for me, that's the equivalent of how society is. And you just have men working and they're doing stuff and they're making decisions for a world where women and youth also live in this world. And I'm like, how do you expect to come up with a winning strategy and a winning approach when half your team is on the bench, right?
Sure.
So women being in the game is important. There's a lot of research that came out about how women were adversely more impacted by the pandemic because they work in a lot of frontline positions, because they traditionally work in a lot of retail positions, and those were the sectors that were most affected by the pandemic. And that ripple effect into households was also visible from an economic point of view. If we look at Africa in general, 50% of our population is youth, and 50% of those youth are under the age of 16. So when we're looking at future projections about who are going to be the future employees, these are the people that we're looking at. If we're thinking about who are going to be the future startups and their founders, it's the young people, Sure. If we look at social issues, so the third sector in general, oftentimes it's women who run those volunteer organizations. So the things that you don't see happening in society, and so oftentimes we don't see who does frail care, we don't see who does childcare, we don't see a lot of those things that are important that need to be looked after. And because we don't see it, we assume it's not happening, right? But these young people that show up and become executives one day were at some point a child that was raised by a mom. So we need to think about where women fit in the roles that women play, not just at home, but in business and also within corporate as well. And make sure that perspective is brought in, because if you don't see it, if you don't count it, you don't measure it, you don't create a strategy around it. And it's kind of presumptuous to just think that men around the table by themselves can come up with the most effective strategy. Another thing we will see with people that track or studies that have tracked venture capital funds, angel investing funds, as well as startups that have more women on the board, is that VCs that have women as part of that group making decisions are more likely to fund female-led startups as well. And then startups that have women within their structures are also more likely to be successful as well, or to be more sustainable. So there's a lot of research in the background as well that also backs the positive impact and the ripple effect of what happens when you have women as part of the ecosystem, and give them decision-making power and positions as well. And then I think ultimately that overall impact into our communities.
I could not agree more. Most certainly could not agree more. I lied. I said that was the last question. This is the last question.
Sure.
What gets Ntsiki out of bed in the morning and gets you going? You're clearly very passionate. You're clearly very energetic. And you really, really have a big vision. What gets you up in the morning and gets you enthused and gets you electrified so that you can deal with the day? And listen, every day isn't easy. We know that. The days aren't all easy. So you got to put this smile on. You got to do what you do. What gets you there?
Making an impact, I think a lot about that. And I think this might be down to my sort of type 7 personality style in the Enneagram, which is something that I do coaching on for teams as well. But if you look at the driving side for each of the triads, I belong in the head triad. And that's, the thinking center, and the fear aspect in that is what really drives the type 7. And when I think about my fear, I go like, my biggest fear in life is not being everything that I could be, and it's kind of that kick that gets me out, not just from a fear perspective, but also from an impact perspective, to go, I have the pleasure, the joy, and the privilege to wake up every day and to do what I love and to do what I enjoy. And I also have the benefit that what I do also has an impact on people's lives. And it's an honor to be able to do that every day. And so I enjoy doing it. I enjoy working with corporates to do that as well. And it's also understanding the uniqueness that I bring to the table, so yes, I can give all these business insights, but practically I can also speak to what do those solutions look like, so it's not just about, hey, let's go support this community somewhere, but it's to say, for my specific company with the products that we make, what's the best fit that actually makes sense, and how we create impact utilizing the resources that we have. And if I can help people create impact and make it easier for them as well, then why not?
What a great answer. What a great way to finish as well. And Ntsiki, thank you very much once again for your time and your energy and that passion and that real feel that you've got for this. I can see you love what you do. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today. Trust, of course, you've enjoyed Ntsiki. If you would like to find out more, you simply log on to speakersinc.com, find out whatever you need, make Ntsiki part of your next event. On behalf of Duncan and Bronwyn, thank you so much for being with us, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.